Welcome to CIHT Podcasts.
The UK government has announced the end of rail franchising. The move is expected to significantly shake things up within the industry. And to explore this, I'm pleased to be joined by Sim Harris, Managing Editor at Rail News. I'm your host, Justin Ward. So what does the death of franchising mean for the sector? What will replace it? And where now for the future of the industry?
To be honest, it means we might get some common sense back after 24 years. The Tory rail privatisation programme of the 90s was essentially flawed for one reason. The railways are not profitable, and privatisations do not work if the privatised industry is not being profitable. And the railways haven't been profitable since 1955. There was no prospect of them becoming so again under any form of system. We have to regard them as a public service, a bit like the police or the army or the NHS. We would miss them hugely, and their absence would cost us a lot more than they actually cost us to keep them going. But making a profit, no. And that was the flaw in the privatisation of the 90s. It kept trying to tweak the rules to see if there couldn't somehow be a profit in there somewhere. Of course, there wasn't.
So it wasn't so much the impact of COVID that saw the demise of franchising. It was more that was an acceleration of something that was on the cards already?
That's a very good way of putting it, yes. If you want to think of franchising as a patient, it was already in intensive care long before we'd heard of Wuhan, long before COVID became an issue. As far back as 2012, the Department for Transport made a major miscalculation, awarding a very important franchise, the Intercity West Coast one, and indeed having awarded it, they then had to withdraw it. Huge embarrassment all round, because the civil servants hadn't got their sums right. And really, ever since then, the market, the private sector, the companies who might bid for franchises have been becoming, I'm afraid, steadily more disenchanted with the whole prospect. Some have walked away completely. National Express has. I think Virgin and Stagecoach probably have now, after they fell out with the DfT last year over liabilities for railway pensions. And more the surviving bids tended to be from multiple organisations. Nobody was willing to take the risk on their own anymore. And that, I think, too, gave us a message that rail franchising was increasingly seen as tainted. And if that is how it was seen, I wouldn't disagree.
And it's been replaced by what are called emergency recovery management agreements.
They're emergency recovery measurement agreements, but I agree the word management has been used by some sources, but I think the DfT prefers measurement. It doesn't really matter. This is very much a temporary solution. It simply means that the DfT, the department, collects railway revenue, it meets railway costs, and it gives the operators, who just are clinging on in there, a small management fee for their trouble. That is not a long-term solution, and we'll have to move on.
So what is the long-term solution in your view then?
I think the Transport Secretary would love to hear what the long-term solution is. Since we've not heard what it is, they plainly don't know. One can speculate that it will be a form of concession, which is where you still use the private sector to employ the staff, to maintain the trains, to physically provide the service, but in turn for a fixed fee. There is no profit motive as such, as in there's no chance of making lots and lots of money. What they will do is rely on a steady income. And concessions do work because we have them already. If you've been on Docklands Light Railway or London Overground, you might think you're on a Transport for London service, and technically you are, but the day-to-day operator on those two services is not Transport for London, they are concessions. If you're in the north of England, Manchester Metrolink is a concession. And they seem to be a lot more stable. They don't seem to run into terrible revenue problems because there is no revenue risk. Therefore, the private sector is much more willing to get involved for a modest but safe return.
And how do the ERMAS compare to those agreements then? Are they quite different, or is there similarities?
There are some similarities. They're not quite the same. The emergency measures agreements are very much a short-term thing because the DfT simply pays all the bills and it collects all the money, which is a very easy way to do it, but it's probably not the best thing on the longer term because you don't really want to have partners in a business agreement who are not responsible for any of the costs. So under a concession they are, but they've got to make it clear to themselves just what fee they need so that they can, for example, pay the train staff. They can pay for the maintenance of stations. They can pay for the fuel of trains. They can pay for the leasing costs of trains. Now, all these things are done by the concession holders, who charge an appropriate fee, which allows on top, after all the outgoings, a little bit of a something for themselves, and most particularly for their shareholders. So no, the emergency measures agreements are very much short term. They are simply, look, let's just keep going for now, ladies and gentlemen, while we work out something more robust that will take us forward.
Briefly, what has been the impact on the rail sector? Obviously, there's been falls in passenger numbers, but how significant has that been since the pandemic has unfolded?
Well, it's been significant in the short term because so far, at least, it's cost about 3.5 billion in lost fares revenue. The amount going into the fare box, as it's known in the jargon, is around 10 billion a year. And for a while, with rail passenger figures down to single figure percentages, plainly nothing like that was being earned. We're back up again now, but we're still in a confusing state because although in July we were told it's time to go back to work, we're now being told, because the number of COVID-19 cases has risen worryingly again, therefore, no, we've got to stay at home if we can. That's going to have its own effect on public transport revenues in the short term. But I don't think this government, I don't think any government wants to see the railway or related public transport systems fall apart. So for the time being, it's pay up, keep them going, and meantime deal with the big issue, which is not transport at all. It's how to deal with this virus.
The Williams review, it's been long delayed. This is the review of the railways ordered by the government and led by former British Airways Chief Executive Keith Williams. Why the delay? Obviously, probably the pandemic, but what's likely to come out of that review?
I think what's going to come out of that review, we have a fairly good idea, because Mr. Williams has made a number of speeches, both this year and last year, giving very broad hints indeed about what he feels is likely to be best. And his recommendations, as we understand it, we'll have to wait for publication, of course, but as we understand it, his recommendations cover several areas. One is the future of the franchise. Well, we know that now. COVID has finally seen the franchises off. But if COVID hadn't done it, Mr. Williams would. He is in favour of concessions, which we've already talked about, and that is almost inevitably the way forward. He also thinks that the railway is far too dissipated, it's far too disaggregated. There are too many organisations, all of them saying that the other one is responsible for that. It needs a new guiding mind, a new controlling body, in Mr. Williams' view, so I think he's going to recommend that as well. Whether it's going to be quite the same as the Strategic Rail Authority, which existed in the early years of this century, we don't know. I'd rather hope not, because the SRA didn't impress everybody all the time, to put it kindly. Indeed, one newspaper article said the SRA has no strategy and very little authority. We can't just recreate the SRA. That's not the way to do it. I think the reason the SRA didn't work, by the way, is because it didn't actually have a great deal of real power. It did run the franchises. In other words, it awarded them and it would levy penalties if the operators went wrong. But it didn't have enough overall authority over the whole railway. And it was all divided up. There was Network Rail on one side, there was the regulator on another, and there was the SRA on the third. For goodness sake, who's in charge of this? And I think that the new corporate body, which Mr. Williams, as we understand it, is going to suggest will have a lot more real power. It may well need an act of parliament to give it legislative authority, because it's something of the kind we've been missing for a very long time, and it was one of the weaknesses of privatisation. Privatisation didn't really leave anybody indubitably in charge and responsible and accountable. There was nobody with a sign on their desk, as Harry Truman, the president, allegedly had. I think he did have, actually. I think I've seen a picture of it, saying the buck stops here. We need a body now to take control of the railways where the buck does stop. And I think that's something Mr. Williams is going to be recommending.
I would like to hear your thoughts on the Stonehaven derailment when the Aberdeen to Glasgow service crashed after heavy rain. 3 people sadly died, the driver, conductor and a passenger. And Network Rail has admitted that the impact of climate change on its network, in their words, is an area that is accelerating faster than our assumption. Given our rail infrastructure is now about 150 years old, and rebuilding it to modern standards that are climate resilient would be prohibitively expensive, what solutions are being explored by the sector to deal with climate?
Well, what Network Rail has done is divide its earthwork assets, as it's called, as they call embankments and cuttings, into 5 categories. A, those that are pretty good and don't need intervention for the foreseeable future, down to E, those that are not good at all and do need some intervention. Happily, the number in category E is far smaller. So for the first time, I think there's going to be a real concentrated effort to look at those cuttings and embankments which are in category E and do something about it sooner rather than later. And spending is going up on that. And there are 2 separate task forces that are also looking at the whole issue of railway earthworks and also the issue of climate change. It has been a problem for quite a while, although the coast of South Devon has been a railway problem where it runs along the seawall at Dawlish almost ever since it was built. Problems there have got worse. And it's only just over 6 years ago that quite a long stretch of the seawall and the railway underneath it was swept away by 2 successive storms. There has been damage there before, but this is exceptional. And Network Rail is building all kinds of new structures at Dawlish to protect the railway. It's something we're going to have to do a lot more in. You're right, the railway in many cases is over 1.5 centuries old. And in many cases it was built at a time when the engineering dynamics of embankments and cuttings were only imperfectly understood. We know better now, we can do better now, so it's a matter of investing in it, of getting on with it. And meantime, as I suppose you could possibly quote that Corporal Jones character, don't panic, because there really is no need to panic, but there is a need to get on with it.
Well, thank you. That was an interview with Sim Harris, Managing Editor at Rail News. Thank you.
Thank you.